Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm checking out this new album from Bush, I Beat Loneliness. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So Bush just released their 10th studio album on July 18th, and this is the follow-up to their 2022 album, The Art of Survival. And when that album came out, that was the first new Bush album I had listened to, right around release time in probably almost 20 years. But Bush was one of those bands in the middle part of the 90s that I think really helped shape alternative rock music, especially in that like post-grunge landscape we were in. And their 1994 debut album, 16 Stone, was a massive hit. And it was actually one of the albums that made me want to become a musician, create my own band when I was only 15 years old. It hit number 4 on the Billboard 200. It sold over 6 million copies here in the U.S. But Bush was one of those bands that I was really always surprised at how successful they were here in the U.S., but they weren't really as successful in their home country. Because what I always thought was interesting was, most English bands, that's where they get their start at, is over in the UK. That's where they form that fan base at, and then they expand from there. And that's not really what Bush did. Bush was able to come over here, conquer the U.S., and then, it didn't really follow through in their home country. And 16 Stone would become one of those staple alternative albums of the 1990s. And they'd follow that up with an album that I've long considered one of the best albums of the 90s. And as much as I loved 16 Stone, I thought Razor Blade Suitcase, released in 1995, was even a step better. It wasn't as commercially successful as 16 Stone. I think it only sold 2 or 3 million copies here in the US. But it became the band's first and only #1 album on the Billboard 200. And after Razor Blade Suitcase, Bush would release 2 more studio albums, with The Science of Things in 1999, which I thought was a really good album. I didn't think it quite lived up to what they did on their first 2 albums. And then you had Golden State 2001, and the band would go on this 10-year hiatus after that. And I think it was around that time that they released The Science of Things that I really started losing interest in Bush. I mean, my musical interests were going in a lot of different directions. I don't think Bush was really doing anything all that different than what they did earlier in their career. I thought The Science of Things and Golden State, they were both good albums. I would semi-regularly listen to them, but it was really only like the big hits off of those albums that I listened to on a pretty consistent basis. And then in 2010, the band reformed with just Gavin Rossdale and Robin Goodrich being the only 2 original members of the band. They brought in Chris Traynor to play guitar. Corey Britz played bass in this new form of Bush. And while they would release some good albums, they were never able to quite capture what that earlier version of that band was. And then Robin went on to believe in the band in 2019. That was after they released Black and White Rainbows in 2017. He ended up being replaced on drums by Nick Hughes. It wasn't until Bush released the 10-year anniversary edition of the Sea of Memories in 2021 for Record Store Day that I would rediscover the band. And at that time, the band had released 4 studio albums since they reformed in 2010, and I had not listened to a single song off any of those albums. And at first I wasn't even going to grab that RSD version. I think I was sitting in line the night before, and I was like, it's a decent price. I want to say it was like 25 or 30 bucks. I decided to grab it, and I took it home. I think it was one of the first albums I listened to once I got home, and I was really impressed with the quality of it. Once again, did it live up to the standards they set on those first 2 albums? No, but there was still really good tracks on that album. And since rediscovering the band, I've grown to appreciate what Bush has become, 30 plus years into their career. Eric Ron is back to help co-produce the new album. This is actually the 3rd straight Bush album he's co-produced with Gavin Rossdale. And the first time I listened to this album, my very first thought of it was, it's much more of it's a lot heavier of an album than I was expecting it to be. I mean, it's not as heavy as, say, a heavy metal album, but, it's heavier than I was expecting from Bush. I mean, they've always had this heavier streak in their music, especially compared to a lot of those other alternative or post-grunge bands in the middle part of the 90s. But the band did move to a little bit heavier tone when they reformed in 2010. And I think the absence of Nigel Pulsford on guitar made a big change in the overall sound of the band when they reformed. And bringing in Chris Traynor, who had previously played with Orange 9mm and Helmet, he brought a little bit heavier sound with him. And over the last few albums, this new version of Bush, I think, sounds a lot different than the version that created 16 Stone and Razor Blade Suitcase. And it sounds like with I Beat Loneliness, the band tried to kind of merge that older sound with what the band is now. And I think in some ways it worked, in some ways it wasn't quite there. And one of the first things I noticed, other than it being a little bit more of a heavier album, is the way the album is sequenced. Track listing means a lot to me, and I know it probably doesn't. in this digital age we live in where most people just stream their music and get their music off of playlists. But the way the album is sequenced kind of tells a story. And I wasn't a huge fan of the way they sequenced this. So the album is kind of broken up in two halves. So you've got the first half being more of a heavier style, and then the last half of the album has more of those like ballady kind of tracks on it that Bush has had across their career. So it almost feels like two different EPs that they smushed together to make one album. I think had they kind of broken that up a little bit and had a little more of a varied sound across the album, I think it would have helped the overall experience of the album. Kind of like blending those harder and softer sounds. So prior to the album release, the band only released 2 different singles off of this album. So you had 60 Ways to Forget People and The Land of Milk and Honey. Those are the only 2 singles. I decided I wasn't going to listen to both of them. I only picked one of them, and it wasn't until like the week before this album came out that I listened to the single off of it. So I listened to The Land of Milk and Honey, and right away, I thought that song was better than anything the band had released off their last couple of albums. Even though I liked those albums, I thought they were good albums. This song was just a notch better, I thought. And I went from somebody who I just didn't really know what to expect on this new album to, after listening to that song, I was actually excited for its release. And I give the band a lot of credit for only releasing 2 singles off the album because, they didn't jump on this growing trend over the last couple of years where bands have been releasing, 3, 4, 5, 6 singles sometimes before the album's released. So it kind of robs the album of some of that anticipation that you'd have because you've already listened to, a third or half of the album before the album comes out. And then as the listener, you've already heard half of the album, so you can kind of get a feel of the album before it comes out. But, that's not really always how it works. There's sometimes, a lot of times, where the singles work better as a full piece on the album than what they do as a single. And I'd love to see bands get back to only releasing 2 or 3 singles before the release. I know it's probably not going to happen because bands release all those singles because you stream all those tracks and then, they think people are going to be more excited for the album. But I think in reality, a lot of people listen to those tracks over and over and over again. And then by the time the album comes out, they're almost sick of those songs. I think it's critical, especially the streaming age we live in now, where an album starts off with a very strong song. Because I think you really only get one chance to make that first impression. And it's got to be something that pulls the listener in, makes them want to listen to the album. Because if it's not, they've got every other option to listen to anything on their phone. They'll just move on to something else if the first song or 2 doesn't grab them. I think if you pick the right song to start the album, not only do you set expectations for the album, but you also set the tone for the album also. So the song they picked to open the album was Scars. And I thought it was a good pick because it does I think it is one of the stronger songs on the album. It also blends a lot of those harder and softer tones that they have. The song starts off a little slower, and the first time I listened to it, I didn't really know the direction it was going to go. And then it breaks into some of the heaviest music on the album. And that's why I say it's a good pick, because it has a lot of those elements that you're going to see across the album. And carrying through the track, you've got those heavier moments and those lighter moments blended back and forth. It gives the song, I think, more of a unique feel. I think it's a great pick to start the album because it's an amalgamation of the entire album. The song has that industrial feel to it, even though it's not an industrial song, if that makes any sense. The second song on the album is the title track, I Beat Loneliness, and I think this probably would have been a better pick as the lead single for the album because I think it's definitely one of the best tracks on the album, might be the best track on it. In some ways, I think it's a little more of an aggressive song than the opening track Scars, but it also has this almost anthemic sound to it. And I think the song is a perfect example of the blending of that older 90s style of Bush with this, post-reunion, the Sea of Memories version of the band. And since their reunion, this might be one of the best songs the band has recorded. It's a hard and gritty track with these more open and honest lyrics from Gavin, and a lot of the themes across this album deal with a lot of the personal struggles he's dealt with over the last several years. His mother also battled a long illness, and she passed earlier this year. I think her death and her sickness had a lot of impact and influence on this album. Next comes The Land of Milk and Honey, which is the second single off the album. It's catchy and aggressive, and I think the chorus of this song, I think, makes it one of the more memorable tracks on the album. And like I said earlier, when I first listened to the song, I went from being on the fence about this album to having more anticipation for it. After that listen, I was expecting this to be an improvement over their last album. The next song is We're All the Same on the Inside. It continues that heavier tone that's really dominated the album up until this point. A little more of a bass and drum driven track. It doesn't have quite the standout guitar playing that's really dominated the album up until this point. I'm Here to Save Your Life opens with this blast of hard rock before it blends into this more mid-tempo song. Musically, I think it's one of the stronger tracks on the album, but lyrically, I just don't exactly know where Gavin's going with the lyrics on the song, which is an issue at times on this album. Some of the lyrics on these songs don't quite feel as focused as maybe they should. The first single off the album was 60 Ways to Forget People, and this is kind of the entry point into the second half of the album. It still has a lot of those harder, heavier themes, but it starts incorporating more of those softer, lighter tones also. This song almost acts as like a bridge between the first half and the second half of the album. And of the dozen tracks across this album, I think this song is a little more of it's probably the most old school Bush sounding song on it. And out of the two singles, I think it's a little bit of a stronger track. Even though I think both singles are good, I think this one's just a notch better. It's one of the best songs on the album. I think the best way I can describe the song Love Me Till the Pain Fades, it almost has this kind of, almost like Deftones kind of vibe to it. It incorporates some more electronic elements into it, and as odd as that might sound, it does work. It gives a little more of a different sound than the songs off the first half of the album. This is another one of those standout tracks, even though the first couple of times I listened to it, I didn't really love the track. It's one of those tracks that's definitely grown on me the more I listen to this album. The song We Are of This Earth has this almost like melancholy, kind of almost cinematic vibe to the song. It reminds me of an older Bush song. Think like Bone Driven, I think, is a good comparison to the song. It's also the first of a few of those ballad-like songs on the second half of this album. And it's a song that I've seen a lot of people list as, one of the worst songs on this album, one of the skippable tracks on here. But, after 4, 5, 6 listens of this album, it's slowly become one of my favorite tracks on here. Everything Is Broken is one of those tracks I think has a lot of potential. Musically, it's a good song, but lyrically, it just kind of misses the mark. I get where he's going lyrically with the song. I think it just could have been fleshed out maybe a little bit more. Don't Be Afraid is a song that the first couple of times I listened to it, it has this almost kind of familiar feel to the song, even though I can't really put my finger on it. But, overall, it's just one of those songs that's just kind of there for me. I don't think it adds a whole lot to the album. It's not great. It's not terrible. It's just kind of there. Footsteps in the Sand is an interesting song because it starts off with this like techno-ish kind of beginning, which I did not like. But once it moves into this more like traditional Bush sounding style, the song improves. I mean, it doesn't improve enough to have me list this as one of the better tracks on this album, but it's I think had they cut off the beginning or done something a little different with the beginning, it would have made a better track on here. There's another one of those tracks where it's just kind of there for me. I don't think it's a skippable track, but it just doesn't add a whole lot to the album. The album closes with the song Rebel with a Cause, and even though it's one of those slower kind of songs that's dominated the second half of the album, it finishes off the album with a little more of a kind of upbeat theme. And I think it's a good track to end the album with. It kind of bookends the opening track Scars, where Rebel with a Cause is one of the stronger tracks on not only the second half of the album, but the album overall. Overall, I thought it was a good album. This album definitely has some issues, though. My biggest, I think, is the way the album is sequenced. Had they kind of blended those songs a little more across the album, kind of mixed it between those heavier and lighter songs, and not kind of had it so jarring. It's almost kind of disjointing when you listen to the album and you hear this heavier half to start the album and then kind of ends with this kind of a lot of like downbeat kind of songs. It just has too much of a somber tone, I think, across the second half of the album. Had they kind of mixed that up a little bit differently, I think overall would have been a better overall experience. But on a scale of 1 to 10, I think this album, I've got this album ranked as a 7. We'll see where it ends the end of the year. It could grow on me a little bit over the coming months, but it's kind of where I rank the last couple of Bush albums also. And I think a band, 30 plus years in their career is probably what the best you can get from them. Especially considering that, in 2010, they brought in basically an entire new band around Gavin Rossdale. And because of that, they're never going to be able to recapture the magic that they had on those first couple of albums. So I don't really expect them to be that Razorblade Suitcase, The Science of Things, 16 Stones kind of band. But they've matured and evolved into what I think is just a really good overall rock band. So when this album was first announced, I didn't really know if I was going to pick up a copy of it on vinyl. I kind of went back and forth. I mean, I've got most of the other Bush albums, so I probably was going to grab a copy of it, but I didn't want to pre-order it. I figured I'd just go to the record store the day it was released. There's 2 different versions that were released. There was a standard black version, and then there was a Coke Bottle Clear version, which is the indie exclusive, which I wanted to get the indie exclusive version of it. I think some of those indie exclusive versions came signed also, so there was a little bit of a price difference, but that was a version I wanted to grab. I figured I'd be able to go to the record store on release day and grab a copy of it, no problem. But to my surprise, I got it Friday morning, and none of the record stores in my area had it available on their website. I actually drove around. I spent half the day on Friday driving to a bunch of different record stores trying to track down a copy of this. I was finally able to track down a copy from Plaid Room Records down in Cincinnati. So I did order it. I've got a copy of it coming, but I don't have it yet. And it's funny because, like I said, I wanted to get the indie exclusive version of it, but I think by the time I went to the second record store, I was like, hell, I'll just grab any copy that's available. And no stores even had the black version of it. So I don't know if everything just sold out in pre-orders or if there was delays in shipping. But I went to 4 different record stores, couldn't find it. I searched through another probably 5 or 6 record stores that are in my area. Nobody had a copy of it. So I will have a copy of it at some point over the next couple of days. I'll probably also go out and grab a copy of it on CD also. I think it's that good of an album. But it was just one of those albums where I could almost guarantee I'd be able to go and grab a copy of this album. I didn't have to get out to the record store first thing in the morning. I figured, midday I'd be able to go out and grab a copy of it, but I was wrong. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think of this new album, I Beat Loneliness by Bush. I think the title of the album, I think they probably could have went with a better title, but I get that it kind of matches the overall theme of the album. Let me know if you guys have listened to it, if you're going to pick up a copy of it. How would you rate the album? And, have you listened to the last couple of albums from Bush? Because, like I said, I rediscovered them in 2021. I was really impressed with the quality over the last couple of albums. Like I said, it's never going to be those, not going to match the albums from the 90s, but I think there's definitely some quality on there. They've got some great tracks across all those albums. But it's nice to see that Bush is still around, putting out quality music, 30 plus years in their career. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.